Welcome to session 4 of Fundamentals of Designing, Monitoring, and Evaluating for Results at GNI. This is part 2 of Designing for Results. During this session, participants should be able to describe the steps that should be taken following project design prior to implementation, identify the purpose and components of the M&E plan, explain the importance of collecting indicator baseline data after project design, and identify options for collection, clarify definitions of key terms in performance management, and identify what should be monitored in addition to data and how. So let's start by reorienting ourselves with the project cycle and where we are. So we just finished designing our project using the log frame. And we designed the log frame based on the assessment. But we're still not ready to begin implementation yet. There's still some key important steps that need to take place before we can start implementing activities. So once you've designed your project's log frame, the next step will be to plan for the reliable collection and management of the data so that it can be efficiently analyzed and used as information. So both data collection and management are firmly linked because data management begins as soon as you start collecting it. The main tools that we'll use for collection and management of data are the M&E plan and indicator tracking tables. The next step will be to actually collect baseline data on the indicators that we identified in our log frame. And we'll be reviewing existing data and collecting new data for this. Then, after we have our baseline data on our indicators, we can set targets that we hope to achieve for those indicators using our baseline data as a reference point. So once all 3 of these steps are completed, then we can begin our project implementation. So let's go through step by step. After we've designed our log frame and identified our objectives and indicators to measure the objectives, then we need to plan exactly how we'll collect our data. So to help us plan, we'll use the M&E plan. And the M&E plan is a table that builds upon the project's log frame. So it expands on and provides more detail for the indicators and the MOVs, which are our sources. The M&E plan allows the project team to cross-check the log frame and the indicators before project implementation. So when you're going into your M&E plan and you're thinking about how you'll collect the data, you might realize that it's not feasible, and so you'll have to change some of your indicators. So it allows the project team to cross-check that. It puts the log frame into action, and it allows us to see whether people understand the indicators in the same way. And it facilitates the incorporation of monitoring into implementation activities. So sometimes the M&E plan, you might hear it called the indicator plan, performance measurement plan, M&E framework, lots of different terms for the same thing. For GNI, we're calling it the M&E plan. So we discussed the log frame in detail and our indicators in the log frame. We discussed that in the last session. So we know that they fill up the second column of the log frame here. And this column now is the basis for our M&E plan. So we'll take all of the indicators from this column and we'll put them in their own separate table. Then we need to clarify for every single indicator, what exactly does that indicator mean? What are we talking about? We're going to clarify where are we going to collect the data from and how. When will we collect the data? How often? And who's responsible for each step of the data collection process? So note that the structure of the M&E plan can be adjusted according to needs and usability of the project team, but it should at least include this level of detail. It can include more, of course, but it should at least include these components. It's also up to the project team whether they want to include activity indicators or not. but outcome indicators and outputs will certainly need this level of detail. So in our M&E plan, we need to define our indicators. So the definition describes exactly how the indicator is calculated. So first we need to make clear the unit of analysis. So are we talking about sponsored children? Are we referring to households? Schools? What exactly are we talking about? That's our unit of analysis. We need to define mathematical calculations. So for example, let's say our indicator is literacy rate. We need to explain, spell out here, that this means number of literates in a given age range divided by the total population in that age range times 100. We need to clarify how we calculate that mathematical term. We also need to define any unclear terms. So in that previous example, we're using the term literate. So how do we define literates? We need to make that clear so that when we collect the data now and then collect the data again, we collect it from the same people or the same sources. We need to determine ahead of time and put into this plan if we're going to disaggregate the data, if we need to see it by gender or disaggregate by age, sponsored or non-sponsored. We need to decide those ahead of time and put it into our plan because it'll be too late after we collect the data. So you already identified your MOVs or your sources in the log frame. You're going to include those sources here as well, your MOV, but you're also going to include a lot more detail about the methods that you'll use to collect the data. So you're going to detail your collection methodology and include any tools, whether they need to be developed or whether they already exist. So your actual questionnaires, checklists, whatever tools you might need. And you can include your sampling strategy here. Then you need to explain how often you plan to collect data for each indicator. So this will state whether you're collecting monthly, quarterly, annually, at baseline and endline. You can also include any important dates, such as startup and end dates for tool development or deadlines. And this column sort of helps us think about what's monitoring versus what's evaluation when it comes to our indicators. So depending on which level of the log frame you're measuring, that will help you figure out how often you're going to collect that data. So at our lower levels, activities and outputs, we're monitoring and we're going to collect that data more often. So in this column, your frequency column for monitoring, you'll likely have monthly, quarterly frequencies there. And then at the higher levels, these are your evaluations. And so this is going to be collected less often. It's much more complex and difficult to collect this data. And so you're going to have maybe just collect at baseline, midline, endline, that type for the outcome and goal indicators. So then you also need to include responsibilities. Who is responsible and accountable for this process? So you want to make clear who's responsible and at which point. So who's responsible for the data collection, who's responsible for the tool development, who's responsible for reporting and when. So here's an example of an M&E, piece of an M&E plan from GNI Nepal's health sector. And you can see the level of detail that you need to clarify in this plan. So for example, this indicator, let's say our indicator is % of population using improved sanitation facilities. So you'll notice that you have to define improved sanitation facilities. So not everyone will have the same understanding of an improved sanitation facility. So we need to define it, and they've gone and defined it in detail here. that these 4 types of toilets are considered improved. Then they've also gone and clarified exactly what that calculation is. So this will be the number of people surveyed who report using an improved toilet. So they will have responded that they used one of these 4 toilets, divided by the total number of people surveyed times 100. So that's sort of the level of detail that you need to think about in advance and make clear before you go and actually try to collect the data. And you'll notice that in the M&E plan, there's not actually any data in it. This plan just helps you prepare for data collection, and then we'll develop other tools to put the data in. So now we have a clear plan on how we'll collect the data, and now where do we put that data? So we're going to have to think about data management. A data management system encompasses all aspects of data collection, analysis, reporting, both the tools and processes to be used for each. So tools for data collection are part of the data management system, and they include things like indicator tracking tables, monitoring tools, whether you're going to use mobile data collection or simple paper and pencil. Tools will also include the actual analyses, so an online system, Excel, those are all part of your tools. And then you need to think through your processes. So the processes to be considered in data management system will include the flow of information and roles and responsibilities. So all of these should be planned out before activity implementation begins, but the data management system should continue to be enhanced and improved throughout implementation to make it most effective and in line with actual project needs and procedures. So for data management, you can use something that looks like this, an indicator tracking table. So indicator tracking tables are an important data management tool, and it's used for recording and monitoring indicator performance to inform project implementation and management. So this table might look similar to an M&E plan. You're going to have all of your indicators, the same indicators, in this column on the left. But where the M&E plan prepares the project for data collection, the indicator tracking table is where the data actually goes. So this is where you'll put your baseline data and your performance targets, which you set after baseline data collection, and then your actual data. So again, like the M&E plan, this can have various ways to, various formats, but it should at least include the indicator, baseline data, targets, and actual. So now we know where we'll put our data, so we can actually start collecting our baseline data. And to do this, we'll conduct a baseline study. So a baseline study is a study to identify and describe the initial conditions at baseline before the start of a project for comparison at a later date. So midline or endline or at whatever point is needed. The baseline study uses that M&E plan that we talked about as a guide for data collection. And the baseline study forms the basis for measuring change over time. So baselines are the first critical measurement of the indicator. And at this point, you also might identify that the indicator is not feasible to collect on. So you'll have to revise at this point as well. And the baseline study provides an opportunity to pilot those indicators. So that's where you'll determine if they're feasible or not. Baseline study also provides the basis for target setting. So we can't set our targets for our indicators until we know where we are now. So the term baseline study and assessment is often confused and used interchangeably. But there are actually 2 distinct activities to be carried out at different times in the project cycle and for different purposes. So in session 2, we talked a lot about the assessment, and right now we're discussing the baseline study. Hopefully you remember that the assessment takes place before the project has been designed. So we're using the assessment to guide our project design. And then the baseline study takes place now after project design. And then the results of the assessment are used to inform our project design. And instead, the results of the baseline study are used to set targets for the actual indicators and to compare the baseline values with end-line values so that we can evaluate the effectiveness of the project. So 2 different things at 2 different points in the cycle. So why is baseline data so important? Well, without baseline data to establish the pre-operation conditions, it's difficult, or really impossible actually, to establish whether any change has occurred. So let's look at this picture to see a visual example. So this is a photo of, this is a photo taken after completion of the project activity. So what do we see? We see a classroom, looks nice, but what can we tell by this picture? Not much, really, because we have no way to know what it looked like before. We have no comparison. So now, let's say we do have baseline data, and before implementation, this is what it looked like. So we can really see that there's been a change. There's been a real improvement. We have evidence of the difference because we can compare the before and after. So this visual example holds true for all indicators, and it's especially important for indicators at the outcome level. So collected data will be the evidence that will show the project's progress or outcomes upon the monitoring and evaluation. I don't know what that was. So like each step that we discussed before, the timing of the baseline study is very important. And as we already discussed, and I hope you see the reason for now, the assessment, the log frame, and the M&E plan are prerequisites for the baseline study. So they should come before the baseline study. And then, similarly, the baseline study is a prerequisite for project implementation. And project implementation should come after the baseline study, ideally. So delays in conducting the baseline study, especially when operations activities have already influenced the outcome and impact of performance indicators, it's likely to lead to an underestimation of the overall project impact. So we're missing some impact that we could be using to gain support. So we really want to conduct the baseline as soon as possible. Now, when preparing for a baseline study, there's a lot that needs to be considered. We need to think about when will we conduct the study. So within the project timeline itself, we just talked about how it should come before project implementation, but also related to participants' lives. So we need to consider what they're doing every day and at what point during the day should we collect the data. Is it farming season and no one will be in the homes for us to collect data from them? We need to consider the participants themselves. So we have to think about the target group, and then we also have to think about the sampling of that target group. We have to think about the data itself. So how will data be collected? How will it be stored and analyzed? And depending on the data complexity, do you have the human resources to analyze it properly? We need to decide ahead of time how we want to disaggregate, as this will determine who we collect that data from. And we need to think critically about our tools. So the questionnaire itself for a study can make the survey successful or not. So every single question should really be critically analyzed and thought through. And every possible response to that question should be thought through as well. I also need to think about language issues. So if you have translated it, make sure that it's translated properly and can be translated both ways. And you'll need to think about the length of the survey, not too long, and beware of sensitive subjects. When it comes to enumerators, we need to make sure they're trained consistently, all in the same manner. Need to consider the language. Of course, they should speak the same language as the local population. And consider gender sensitivity. So especially if you have any sensitive questions or subjects, you'll probably want males to collect data from males and females from females. Also think about their attitude and willingness. So what is there to ensure that the data collectors are collecting and reporting accurately? Some other considerations: cultural, gender, ethical considerations, confidentiality, and think about the expectations that you're raising when you're doing a study. So just by going into a community and asking them certain questions about health or education, just by asking them these questions, they might assume that you're going to provide. So think about the expectations that you're raising and only ask what's necessary for your project. So all of these considerations, among others, is why hiring external support is highly recommended for the baseline study. So because baseline studies are so important for the future results comparison, and they're often technically complex, like we just talked about, GNI recommends outsourcing as the first choice for your baseline study. So when outsourcing, make sure to maintain close collaboration between GNI staff and the consultant to ensure common understanding of objectives and every single indicator. So you want to have regular meetings with DM&E staff, sector staff, CDP staff, and the consultant. And then the deliverables from the baseline study that's been outsourced, that it's all GNI property. So the second option is to conduct the baseline study by GNI staff. Most GNI projects are complex enough that the baseline study should be outsourced. Only simple projects will not need external support. And in the occasional situation where competent external support cannot be found locally and GNI staff needs to conduct it on their own, the following steps can be followed. So you'll want to use your M&E plan as your guide and develop a baseline study plan. This needs to include a detailed schedule and budget. Then you need to develop appropriate tools for collecting the data on each indicator. And you need to pilot those tools. And if necessary, revise the tools and the indicators. You need to create a database for entry of that data and hire and train enumerators. Then you can actually collect the data, finally, followed by compiling, clean, and analyzing, and then finally writing your report on the results and including your data in your indicator tracking tables that we discussed. And then you can set targets for your indicators based on the baseline data. So the baseline study and evaluation, as we already discussed, the main purpose of collecting baseline data is so that we can compare the status of indicators later on with the initial or baseline status of the same indicators. So more simply, so that we can see results. A baseline study then is the analysis describing initial conditions of specific indicators before the project, and then the endline study is a measure made at the end of the project to compare with baseline conditions and assess that change. So let's look at an example of one of our indicators. Let's say our indicator is primary enrollment rate, and we go out and we collect data at baseline. So before our activities have started, we collect data, and we find that the primary enrollment rate is here. Then, several years later, after we've been working really hard with our community on increasing the primary enrollment rate, we collect data again at end line, so post-intervention, and we find that the data has gone up to here. So now we can compare pre-intervention and post-intervention, and we can actually see that there's been a change. We can actually see results. Now, when we're conducting the baseline study, we should always keep in the back of our mind the end line study, because they rely on each other for meaning. So without the end line, the baseline is not necessary. Without the baseline, the end line doesn't mean anything. And we need to follow the same methodology at baseline that we do at end line. So this is why the M&E plan is so important. It gives us that place to document and detail the plan for consistent data collection over the span of several years. It's also important to note that end-line studies are often called evaluations, or the terms are used interchangeably, but the end-line study is not an evaluation itself. It is a part of the evaluation and an important part for assessing change, but not an evaluation on its own. So now we have collected baseline data on all of our project indicators, and we know the pre-project conditions of the indicators in our log frame. So now we can actually go and set performance targets. So a target is a specified objective that indicates the number, timing, and location of that which is to be realized. So targets represent commitments from the project team to achieve something in concrete terms. The process of target setting can be really useful itself. The process should be a participatory process, and it can help to keep the project expected results realistic. It can help plan resources. It allows for tracking and reporting progress against these targets, and it helps inform decision-making and uphold accountability. So as long as you're setting those targets with stakeholders, you're ensuring accountability here. So target setting is difficult, and project teams may hesitate to set targets. They might be afraid that they may not accomplish the targets they set, or it's just too confusing to set targets, too complicated. And a natural tension exists between the need to set realistic targets, which are achievable in terms of resources and the duration of the project, and then the desire to set ambitious ones. So if they're set unrealistically high and they're not reached, then this could damage confidence and credibility, and it can also lead to the possibility of distorting data. So target setting is important, but it is a complicated issue. Target setting is not a science, it's an art. So it means there's a lot of things to consider, and there's not a simple mathematical calculation that can be used to set targets for all indicators. When setting targets, some things that you might want to consider. Of course, current baseline data should be the first starting point. And the team will also consider project duration and resources available. The team will also consider the program context, so risks and assumptions. We need to be looking at those. What might be a reasonable target in one project site might be impossible in another, even for the same indicator. So that just depends on the project context. Consider prior trends if the data is available. And look at evaluation findings or reports that you have from your previous activities. And you'll also want to consider stakeholder input for target setting, as they likely have the most realistic understanding of the context and what's possible. Now, to tie it all together, let's quickly review the process for project design. So first, after we've done the assessment, we're identifying our stakeholders. Are the right stakeholders involved in this process? And then we are determining with our project team, what are the intended results? What do we want to have as our goal and our outcomes and our outputs? Then, once we've identified our objectives or our intended results, we need to decide how will we measure change in those objectives. So we're going to set indicators. Then once we've set our indicators, we need to figure out, is baseline data available for those indicators? If it's already available, then you can go ahead, collect that data or review that data and set targets. If the baseline data is not available, then determine, is it possible to collect? If it is, you go and collect it and then set your targets. If it's not possible to collect, then you need to choose different indicators and then start back at this point in the design. So following completion of the above-mentioned project design and planning processes, project teams will be able to fill in the PPF. So the M&E plan and the log frame are the components that go into the PPF. And more detailed information and guidance on completing this can be found in the PPW PPF User's Guide. So the PPF is designed only to include the M&E plan without baseline data or targets. This is because the baseline study is supposed to be done after the planning is finalized, like we just talked about quite a bit. So after baseline study is complete, then GNI field countries should submit the final framework, which you see here, which does include the baseline data and targets. So we've already talked quite a bit about monitoring of indicators, as we talked about with the M&E plan. But indicators are not the only thing that need to be monitored in our projects. So whether we're talking about indicators or non-indicators, we need to define ahead what we plan to monitor and how. So project teams, in addition to those indicators, we also want to monitor quality, compliance with plans, guidelines, standards, and requirements. We want to monitor resources and context. So we identified our risks and assumptions in our log frame, and we want to continue to monitor those. We need to monitor arising challenges and issues. And we definitely want to consider feedback from the community. So we need to actively go and request and monitor that feedback. So we'll do this type of monitoring using field visits. So we might do direct observation of the project activities to monitor quality. We'll have regular meetings with internal and external stakeholders at all levels. So just having these meetings on a regular interval is considered monitoring. You can have individual interviews with project participants and establish accountability mechanisms such as a complaint box to monitor feedback from the community. So whether we're talking about indicator monitoring or non-indicator monitoring, monitoring is an essential part of results-based management. It's key for timely project improvement and accountability. And remember that monitoring is not just data collection. It needs to be this cycle of collecting and, most importantly, adjusting our programs if necessary. Now, in the next session, Our final session, we'll discuss evaluation and improvement of projects to finish out our project cycle.